sexy guys do. Explore what soul and their minds. Thinking about a thing or two, about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no thinking that would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by my college friend, Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Mark, our topic today is map apps, which I think might be a popular episode for people because I have a suspicion that a lot of people are wondering the very questions I asked you to research for this episode. And those questions were, how exactly do these map apps like Google Maps, Apple Maps, Waze, how do they work? And then I had a different question about whether they were programmed simply to get you from point A to point B, or whether it's more complicated than that. Yeah. And to that second question, which we kind of laughed about it when I made the second question at the end of our last episode, I just want to give you a little anecdote from my real life to give you a sense of the context for that second question. So, sure. As you know, my wife and I are not car owners, but we do car sharing with Zipcar whenever we need to visit relatives. And we often are visiting relatives up in the Northeast. So we're driving northeast from New York. And there's a main artery called Route 95 that goes up and down the East Coast. And in order to get to Route 95 from New York City, you have to go on probably the most miserable highway in the New York City metro area, the Cross Bronx Expressway, which is perpetually crawling with traffic, moves very slowly, extremely frustrating. And the reason I bring that up is because as the crow flies to get to our destination northeast of New York, the Cross Bronx is the highway to use, but because it's perpetually snarled and often bumper to bumper traffic, it just seems counterintuitive to have to use that highway. So when we plug our destination into the map app and get the driving directions, more often than not, it tells us to go on the Cross Bronx Expressway. And just from the evidence of my own eyes and my own experience, it just seems like the wrong thing to do. And yet, time after time, the map apps tell us to take the Cross Bronx. So I'm wondering, why is that happening? Is it truly the best way, or is there something else going on there? That's why I asked the question.
Well, thank you in particular for this question. I do like the technical questions. As you know, I'm an enthusiast. And this one in particular was fun. I discovered a lot of things while researching this topic, and I'm excited to explain them to you and to our listeners. So your question was about mobile map apps like Waze and Google Maps, but our story begins with paper maps. I remember those days. I'm sure you do too.
Oh, sure.
In the old days, which are prehistory for today's youth, preparing for a trip often meant purchasing maps from the Automobile Association of America. My mother was a proud member of the AAA.
Yep.
Yeah. And I can remember taking a driving trip with my family from Oregon all the way to the East Coast and back. It was my very first time in New York City on that trip. And we got an entire stack of maps to use along the way. And I can remember sitting down with my mother and planning out our route with a crayon to mark the roads and highways that we took. And that was the map experience up until fairly recently. But behind the scenes, the world of mapping changed all the way back in 1956. Edsker Dijkstra was a Dutch computer scientist who worked at the Mathematical Center in Amsterdam as a programmer on one of the earliest computers. And part of his job was demonstrating the capacity of their new computer. And to do so, he wanted to choose a problem for the computer to work on that non-computing people could understand. So legend has it that in 1956, Dijkstra was shopping in Amsterdam with his fiancée, and he took a quick break for a cup of coffee at a local cafe. He was tired from all the walking around, and he got to wondering whether there was some way for a computer to calculate the shortest path between 2 points on a map. After about 20 minutes of thinking about it, he'd come up with an algorithm for performing that calculation. Dijkstra did not think much of the algorithm at first. He didn't even bother to publish it until 3 years later, in 1959. But ultimately, it became a really big deal and the thing he was most known for. The genius of Dijkstra's algorithm is it conceives of a map as a graph of points, and the connections between the 2 points are assigned a weight. To take a simple example, let's say we're looking at a map of a city, and 2 points in the city are connected by a network of streets, each of which is a certain distance long. Dijkstra's algorithm can automatically calculate the series of streets to take to find the shortest path from here to there by adding up the weights of each one of those streets.
Mark, just to clarify, when you say weight, you mean weight, W-E-I-G-H-T, not W-A-I-t.
Yes, the weight of the route.
That's what I thought. Just wanted to clarify.
If we now consider 2 points on the map that are further apart, let's say Seattle and New York City, the weights of the various possible routes from one city to the other would be the cumulative weight of every connection between them, something that would be very hard for a human to calculate, but it's a breeze for a computer. But the weight between 2 nodes isn't limited to simple distance. It can also include the speed limit on the street, restrictions on what sort of vehicles are allowed to travel on them, and so on. The algorithm can consider any number of factors when determining the total weight of a connection between 2 nodes, so it's very flexible. In addition to route planning, Dijkstra's algorithm has also been applied to find the optimal path for routing packets of information between nodes on the internet, calculating how closely related 2 people on a social network are, and providing video game characters with a path in the game world when they're instructed to move from one point to another. There have been refinements to Dijkstra's algorithm. For instance, A* incorporates a heuristic function to estimate the cost of reaching the destination. For example, if you're driving from Seattle to New York, Dijkstra's algorithm would calculate every conceivable path, but A* would prioritize routes that head east based on a straight line distance, avoiding unnecessary exploration of routes that head off in the wrong direction. This makes the calculation faster, which is why A* is often preferred today for applications like generating driving directions.
So with this Dijkstra algorithm, Mark, I mean, I'm no expert on the history of map apps, but are you telling me that the technology existed to do this as 60 years ago? And if so, was anybody exploiting this? Was there a product made 60 years ago?
Not 60 years ago, but in 1996, there was a product that started to use this. Prior to that, it was more of a theoretical function, something that could be done mathematically. And there were a few applications here and there, but it didn't really become mass market until 40 years after he conceived of it. So 1996 was a watershed year. Bill Clinton was president. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was arrested. I met my wife for the first time that year. And MapQuest was launched as the first commercial web mapping service.
And you're not suggesting that those 4 things are connected, are you?
Only 3 of those 4 things are connected. MapQuest and other services like it were based on digital maps that were essentially enormous databases that listed every intersection, and every intersection was associated with certain data. All the other intersections they connected to, the speed limit on those roads, whether any of the roads were one-way, the number of lanes, the addresses of businesses, points of interest, and so on. This data was acquired from various sources and constantly updated. MapQuest was able to draw on the information in this database and use Dijkstra's algorithm, or one of the refinements to that algorithm like A*, to calculate an optimal route from point A to point B, which is what powered its most famous feature, custom driving directions. Instead of purchasing a regional map and figuring out which roads to take, now the service would tell you how to get from here to there, and it did it for free. I can remember printing out MapQuest driving directions when my then girlfriend, who later became my wife, and I were taking a trip out of town. Technically, this was still a paper map experience, but the fact that you could get custom, personalized driving directions felt like a minor miracle at the time.
Agreed. I remember doing the same thing, but I have to tell you, the word MapQuest has not crossed my lips in a long time. Do they even still exist? Do you know?
They do still exist. You can use the MapQuest driving direction app on your phone, provided you're on Android. I don't believe it's available for iPhones. So they are still around, but not a major player. For the next chapter in our story, we need to look to space and step back a little in time. GPS, or the Global Positioning System, is a space-based radio navigation system that provides location, velocity, and time information to users anywhere in the world. Development of GPS began in 1973 as a resource for the military. It was first designed for the U.S. Air Force. And the first satellite was launched in 1978, but just 5 years later, in 1983, President Reagan authorized the use of GPS by civilian commercial airlines to improve navigation and safety for air travel. Within about 10 years, handheld GPS units started to become available to consumers, but the first units were bulky and expensive. The Magellan Nav 1000, which came out in 1989, weighed 1.5 pounds, offered only a few hours of battery life, and cost $3,000. And those are $1989. The equivalent today would be about $7,600.
That sounds like the equivalent of those huge mobile phones that looked and felt like bricks, you know?
Yeah, like carrying a boombox around on your shoulder.
Yeah. But you're an early adopter type. So true confession, Mark, did you get one of these GPS systems when they first came out?
I did not. My first time using an in-car GPS system was when my wife and I were taking a driving trip down the coast. And so I got one specifically for that. It was quite a bit smaller, quite a bit cheaper. I think it cost about $30. And even then, it felt amazing to me that it knew where we were on the road and alerted me when I needed to make a turn. And it honestly saved our life one time when we were trying to make it to a restaurant for an anniversary dinner. And it turned out to be in a coastal Oregon city that didn't have any markings on the streets or streetlights or anything. It would have been impossible to get there without knocking on doors and asking for directions. But the GPS got us right there. So I loved that little thing.
It's just amazing that a satellite can guide you to where you're going.
Right.
Yeah.
So GPS became much more useful when it became integrated into smartphones. The first smartphone to include a GPS chip was made by a company called Benephone. Their GPS-enabled phone came out in 2000 and was marketed primarily in Europe. But in 2007, the first iPhone came out and included a built-in GPS chip and a mapping app. The iPhone made smartphones much more popular and kicked off the age of the smartphone mapping experience, an age that we're still living in today. As the price of GPS chips dropped and their accuracy increased, the use of GPS for applications such as in-car navigation and location-based mobile services grew rapidly. Our old friend MapQuest was the first company to release an app for mobile devices that included free turn-by-turn voice commands, which was back in 2012. Today, an estimated 1 billion drivers worldwide use smartphone apps for navigation. And now, at last, we're finally getting to the point of answering your question, because the combination of digital mapping, algorithm-powered driving directions, ubiquitous mobile phones, and GPS technology allowed for the modern driving experience, which now includes real-time updates to the underlying map data. Waze provides the best example. Waze is a community-driven navigation app that relies on user data to monitor and relay traffic information for its maps in more than 185 countries. There are three main ways that Waze collects data from its users. First, Waze has a network of about 500,000 volunteers who are continually editing the maps used in the app. And on top of that, Waze uses machine learning algorithms to analyze historical traffic patterns and predict future conditions. By understanding typical traffic flows at different times of the day, days of the week, and specific dates, such as holidays or annual events, Waze is able to predict traffic congestion before the issues arise. Second, users actively report on live events happening on the road, such as traffic jams, accidents, obstructions, construction, road closures, and the presence of police officers. Users aren't required to report on these things, but they can choose to do so by hitting buttons in the app. In 2014, Waze launched its Connected Citizens program, now called Waze for Cities, to engage with local authorities throughout the world to share traffic data and other information, such as road closures. Waze notifies its government partners of traffic incidents and user reports of road closures, which allows cities to respond more immediately to emergencies and road congestion, and in return, those cities share their road data with Waze. As of 2018, there were 600 local partners in the Waze for Cities program, but I wasn't able to find information that was any more current than that because Waze really needs to update its webpage. At any rate, the main point is that Waze is looking for any and every source to get detailed real-time information on road conditions all over the world. In addition to this data, users of Waze are constantly passively relaying information about driving speed and traffic conditions whenever they have the app open on their phone. That is to say, whenever you're using Waze for directions, the app is reporting your location and rate of travel, so that if there's a traffic jam, a slowdown, or a road closure, Waze will know about it right away, and it can adjust your ETA based on what it knows about the current rate of travel on the roads you'll be taking to your destination. The app aggregates data from millions of users and allows Waze to compile highly accurate and timely traffic information, often faster than traditional traffic monitoring systems. Waze can combine this real-time information from users with the historical information it has on every road in every country when it's calculating the fastest route from point A to point B. In a nutshell, Waze's innovation was to add crowdsourcing to the mix. And the genius of that is the more popular the app gets, the better it does at predicting an optimal route. As of 2023, Waze had roughly 140 million active users who are constantly updating its maps. And the better the app is at giving you the fastest route, the more people will want to use it, which in turn improves the quality of the data flowing into their maps. So let's think back to the early days of Dijkstra's algorithm. Maybe when he was sipping that cup of coffee and resting his sore feet, the only weight he mentally assigned to the connections between two nodes in the graph inside his head was the distance between those 2 points. Adding speed limit to the mix was an obvious way to make route planning more effective. But today, when pretty much everyone has a phone in their pocket, and a very large number of those people use mobile apps to get driving directions, there's a whole range of factors that can go into the calculation of a route. And this all happens in real time, changing every single moment. If there's an accident reported on a road, the weight of that road segment goes up. If there's construction on a highway and 3 lanes are temporarily routed into 1 lane, the weight goes up. If there's bumper-to-bumper traffic on a road, the weight goes up. On the other hand, if a bunch of Waze users are passively sending back data indicating that traffic is moving at a rapid clip through a previously obstructed area, the weight of that road segment goes down. So if you're using Waze or Google Maps or Apple Maps, and in the middle of your trip it suggests a reroute, you can reasonably assume that a weight has changed on the route in front of you, either the weight of the road you're currently on or the weight of a road that you'd soon be turning onto if you had kept to the original directions.
With minds like steel traps, more than joy here to discern the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. And explain, it's a calling and they do it for you. Explain me, baby, explain it. It's appalling that you don't do it too.
So with all this real-time user data flowing around, you might be wondering, who is Waze or Google or Apple sharing my data with? And the answer is they share it less than you might think. If you know anything about Google, Apple, and how those companies feel about each other, it's not that surprising that they don't share traffic data with one another. Neither company is going to want to give the other a leg up on providing a better map experience. I was surprised to learn, however, that Waze and Google Maps also do not share data because in 2013, Waze was purchased by Google. You would certainly think that it's in both services' best interest to share data because better real-time data makes for better driving directions. But after the purchase, Waze continued to operate as a separate entity within Google, and none of your Waze data flows into Google Maps or vice versa.
Wow, that is a real head scratcher for me because I could totally understand Google buying Waze if they want to get their hands on that crowdsourcing innovation. But then to not use it in their own product, I mean, it makes you wonder, why did they buy Waze in the first place?
Yeah, it definitely poses that question. Maybe they were concerned that Waze was going to get so popular that people would stop using Google Maps. And so they decided better to join than to fight. But it's a head scratcher.
Yeah.
Some people outside of the tech industry, such as Professor Jane McFarland, director of the Smart Cities Research Center at UC Berkeley, have called for Google and Apple to share road data with one another on the principle that would allow for better overall traffic control. Each routing app provider currently operates independently, meaning that cities do not know how the routing app algorithms will direct traffic at any given moment. And that can be a safety issue in the short term and a planning issue in the long term. Some have argued that the ideal situation would be a cooperative ecosystem in which routing apps and government transportation agencies share data widely to create an optimal state where the average travel time is minimized everywhere for every driver. At the same time, though, others have voiced real concern about the unintended consequences of mass-scale driving direction apps. In many cases, the algorithms may fail to consider factors such as school zones, pedestrian traffic, and road conditions like steep hills or blind turns. More fundamentally, Waze and similar services were never designed to improve the traffic throughout an entire region in aggregate. They are designed to plot the best possible route for every individual user. In essence, every Waze user is competing with every other user, each one trying to reach their destination as quickly as possible. Sometimes that competition will work out well for everyone. When, for instance, Waze routes enough drivers around a traffic jam that the jam has the time to dissipate rather than getting bigger and bigger. Other times, though, the outcome will not be as positive. It's not uncommon to hear reports of some quiet residential street that suddenly sees an influx of traffic or a series of traffic accidents because Waze or one of the other services has calculated that a route that's not optimized for a high volume of traffic is part of the fastest route for a large number of drivers.
Right.
So to get back to your original question, are the mobile mapping apps programmed to find the fastest route, or are there other factors at play? And are there any reasons for us to be skeptical of the directions they provide? If you think of the fastest route as the product of two factors, distance and speed limit, then yes, these apps do consider a large number of additional factors. In addition to what we've already discussed, you can go into these apps and set preferences, for instance, to avoid toll roads or stay off freeways entirely, that could make your trip slower rather than faster. However, in my view, all these additional factors give us reason to be less skeptical of the directions rather than more. Both Waze and Google Maps make money by serving up ads to their users. Waze, for instance, has a feature to pop up an ad in the app when it detects that your car is stopped at a traffic light. And Apple indicates that it will be adding advertising to Apple Maps in the years to come. However, I found no evidence of conflict of interest here. The internet loves a conspiracy more than it loves life itself, but I didn't find anyone insinuating that Waze is telling you to take a certain exit because that road will take you past a business that's purchased advertising. Now, certainly map services are hungry for lots and lots of user location data, and you might have reason to be skeptical of where your data is stored and how it might be used for reasons other than simply getting you to your destination. But as for the driving directions themselves, that still appears to be strictly a function of A-star, Dijkstra's algorithm, and other mathematical methods for calculating the optimal path, taking into account the weight of the roads you're traveling on. Your route might not seem like the fastest path from here to there, but Waze is listening to you and 140 million other active users, some of whom are on the road ahead of you. So it's probably in your best interest to trust in the app and simply follow its directions.
Okay, so you're siding with my wife, who slavishly follows those directions, and against me. Thanks, pal. I want to probe in a couple of ways, but first I want to say something about Dijkstra. Do you know whether this guy ever reaped the windfall that he so richly deserved from this technology, or was he simply born a few decades too early to make any money on this?
He did not take a patent out on the idea. He published it, and it became just part of the parlance of calculating the shortest path. He did win the Turing Award in 1972, which is the highest award for computer programmers. But later in life, he expressed some bewilderment that this is the thing that he came to be known for. He thought that he had done other work that was more significant.
Yes. And if he had only invented it and come up with it in the 90s instead of the 50s, he'd probably be a billionaire, you know?
Yeah, he would have founded a company for sure.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for clarifying that. All right. You mentioned school zones. So that's the other area where I thought there might be a little funky directions given by these apps. Did you see any evidence that the apps might agree, accede to government or private demands to bypass certain roads, like not go down a road that has a school on it, even though it's the fastest or most efficient route? Did you see anything about that kind of stuff?
Nobody brought that up. The bigger concern that I saw is that these maps are sometimes incomplete. particularly for less well-traveled areas. And so, for instance, a school zone might not be marked. So you could have drivers who are told the best way to the freeway is past the school, and they might then drive at a speed that's not safe for school children.
Right.
And then the other example is roads that might be very steep. One thing that Google Maps does not traditionally include is changes of elevation across an entire area. I know that quite well because I ride my bicycle around a lot, and it often gives me a route that no human being could possibly ride a bike up.
I've seen that with walking directions, by the way. You walk across this 10-lane freeway and then, Yeah.
And it should only take you 10 minutes because as the crow flies, that's how long it would take the crow to get there. But a human being, it's 30 minutes or more. Right. So the algorithm is going to act as if the map data is perfect, because that's simply how algorithms work, is they take in the data and they spit out a solution. And outside of major metropolitan areas, the maps are by definition imperfect. And so that's where you run into problems, is when the algorithm is making assumptions that are unwarranted because the underlying data is flawed.
Right. Okay. You did bring up privacy concerns and said that they're surprisingly few and far between. I want to just come back to that one because, Google in particular is notorious for collecting and storing people's user location and search history and all. It's really hard to believe that Google Maps is not at least milking that from user.
Probably is. Yeah.
I totally can understand them not sharing that with Apple, but not collecting it in the first place. That's tough to believe.
Yeah, I personally would not trust Google at all, not to log every destination that it sees me visiting within Google Maps and then try to figure out how to serve up ads to me based on that information.
Right. Yeah.
And then if for some reason the FBI wanted to subpoena that information, then Google would hand it over. Apple is a little bit different because they don't let that sort of information get off of the phone. According to Apple, your location stays on your iPhone. It never goes to Apple. So you maybe have less to fear if you're on an iPhone rather than an Android device.
Right. I have a question about the algorithms, because I was going to ask you if the companies had different algorithms, and it sounds like the Dijkstra algorithm is like the grandfather of the industry, right? But it's safe to assume that each of these competing private companies have refined the algorithm and use a slightly different one. And the reason I ask that question is because I've tried in preparation for this episode. The last time I was in a car with Amy, we tried 2 different map apps for the same directions, and they gave us slightly different directions. And that wouldn't happen in a perfect world, right? So I'm thinking they have slightly different algorithms. Is that the case?
I would be surprised if they're using different algorithms, because the shortest path problem is this ongoing field within mathematics. People base their entire careers on the shortest path algorithms. And so I think probably every company is dipping into that academic research and pulling out the application that they think is most useful. What I think you're seeing there is the different apps are going off of different databases, which are storing slightly different information. And in many cases, that will be the real-time information that we talked about, that there's a pile up over here, there's a slowdown over there. Google, Apple, Waze, they might not have exactly the same snapshot of current conditions, and so they could send you on a slightly different route.
Okay, that makes sense. Question about crowdsourcing. I totally understand what you mean by it being probably the key innovation in the history, other than the algorithm itself, the key innovation in making these apps more user-friendly. But I wonder if there's a consequence of crowdsourcing. And this is something I've often wondered as I'm driving, right? Because you're assuming that there are all these people with their iPhones or Android phones taking their driving directions from Google or Apple or Waze, right? And the question is, wouldn't these apps just funnel more and more people into the same routes, thus ultimately making those routes slower and not the optimal choice? And so I wonder about this because sometimes you often get driving directions through the app and they say take route 1, right? They don't switch up 10 minutes later and say take route 2 instead. They stick you on route 1, but everybody's listening to the same advice. So wouldn't everybody go on route 1, thus in theory making route 2 the better option? What do you think about that question?
So you're proposing the Yogi Berra effect of no one takes that route anymore because it's too crowded?
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
I do believe that it's in theory possible that if every driver on the road were using the same driving app, if everyone was using Waze or Google Maps or Apple Maps, and they were all simultaneously told to take the same exit to get out of the crowded conditions, that would just shift the crowded conditions somewhere else. But it is a real-time thing. It's updated every moment. So if the new route starts to get crowded, then in theory, at least, Waze should stop recommending it because it's no longer providing the optimal rerouting. There's no way to know for sure one way or the other. But if you want to limit the effects, then just use one of the less popular mapping apps. And so it would be you and a small number of trusted friends who are getting the same directions.
It just seems as like an intellectual proposition that the apps are all seeking the same quickest route and there's only one truth, right? So there's one quickest route. And so they're going to send everybody on that route. And by definition, it's not the quickest if everybody is on it. So that's the foundation for my question. Last question, and I'm going off topic. I did not ask you to answer this, but it is a philosophical question that I would like us to ponder at the end of this episode, which is, are we all losing our sense of direction by relying so heavily on map apps? And I think of my 2 kids who are digital natives, and I've had situations with them where we're getting somewhere in the subway, right? We're not using map apps. We're coming out of the subway and it's a big subway station and there's like 6 different entrances. So you don't know which of the 6 ways to come out in order to be closest to your destination, right? And we get out and my kids are utterly lost because they have no sense of direction whatsoever. And they're reaching for their phones to plug it in to see where the restaurant is or wherever it is we're going. And I'm doing some old fashioned things like looking at the position of the sun. And if it's low in the sky and it's the end of the day, I know that's west, or thinking about Fifth Avenue, the traffic is going downtown. So if this is going downtown, we must be on Fifth Avenue, right? Things like that my kids seem utterly incapable of doing. And I would contend that it's because they're digital natives and they're relying entirely on these apps. So I've stacked the deck for you in this question, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that phenomenon. Are we losing our senses of direction?
Well, I'm probably the wrong person to ask because I never had a sense of direction in the first place. I can clearly remember the days back in Chicago when you and I were in school there. And I'd come up from the subway and I'd have no idea where I was or which direction I should start walking. And at least 2/3 of the time I'd start walking in the wrong direction, realize it, turn around and start walking the other way.
Right.
So for me, GPS was a godsend because that part of my brain was never there in the first place. It's entirely possible, sure, that you won't acquire certain skills if your phone will do that for you. It's kind of like what happens when a hurricane blows down cell towers and cuts out cell service, and nobody knows how to communicate anymore because we got rid of our landlines, and this is how we stay in touch and how we connect with the news and know what's going on. Like once our phone goes out, then we're screwed. And yeah, you do lose a little something because you transfer that to a device instead of doing it yourself. So there's a possibility there. But as for me, my only chance of ever getting to my destination was to have a device tell me how to get there. And so I personally didn't lose anything because I didn't have anything to lose.
Fair enough. Well, thank you very much. That was really interesting. And I'd like to say this is one of our more practical episodes of Mansplaining because it's about something that a lot of people actually use every day as opposed to some of our more theoretical questions. So hopefully other people will enjoy this one as much as I did.
Yeah, I hope so.
All right. So I presume you have a question for me for next time?
Yeah, the question for next time concerns something that I've been wondering about for a while, which is, it might have been a couple years ago, I read a startling statistic that I'm not sure is true. And so part of the question is the veracity of the statement. And the statement is that the average American has $4,000 in savings. And that posed for me a scenario in which we will have an entire generation of people who are unable to retire because they simply do not have enough saved in order to pay medical bills, let alone living expenses. And so that figure has always made me wonder, is there a demographic disaster waiting to happen with a set of Americans who the cost of living has eliminated their capacity to save for retirement? Or was that, in fact, an overstatement? I'd like to see what the truth is on that matter.
Yeah, great question, and near and dear to my heart, too, because I'm at that age, and I know you are, too, where you start to think about retirement, and this is a huge issue in the United States. And I've wondered that myself, so I will be happy and interested to research that and come back to you with an answer next time.
Okay, looking forward to it.
Yeah, and so, folks, that's the question for next time. I'm going to go off and research it. Until then, we will see you with a new episode of Mansplaining when I'm ready to answer that question. And between now and then, my advice is to still avoid using the Cross Bronx Expressway, even if those map apps tell you to do so.
Yeah. And my advice, if you're in Seattle and the map apps tell you to take 90 instead of I-5, do not. It never works out. Take I-5, even if it's congested.
Right. So that's the ultimate rejoinder to all this research about map apps. Go with your gut.
Yes.
That was Mark. I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then.
Used to trace my path with crayons on those maps from AAA. Now I'm standing at life's crossroads with no paper maps today. 100 million voices telling me which route I ought to take. But every time I think I know the way, there's another traffic break. Please, Waze, show me the way through this maze of every day. We're calculating as I go, red lights turning into gold. There's construction up ahead, and my battery's running dead. But I trust your algorithm more than what's inside my head.
Got a destination pinned to my existential map, but the shortest path between 2 points might be a total trap. The weight of every decision gets updated in real time, while I'm stuck here at the intersection of your world and mine. Please, Waze, show me the way through this maze of every day. We're calculating as I go, red lights turning into gold. There's construction up ahead, and my battery's running dead. But I trust your algorithm more than what's inside my head. Sometimes I wish old Dijkstra could have solved the human heart. 20 minutes in a coffee shop to figure out this part. But there's no app for the detours or the tolls that life will bring. No shortcut past the questions that keep searching. I trust your algorithm more than what's inside my head.
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.
Best thing is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no faking, that would be uncool.
Attention mansplaining listeners. If you want to engage with Mark and me, you have some options. One is to go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, where you can leave a comment or question, check our sources, suggest topics for future episodes, or just like us, because who doesn't want to be liked? You can also reach us through whatever app you use to listen to this podcast by giving us a 5-star rating or writing a review of your favorite episode. Or you can call and leave us a message on our dedicated voicemail box, which is 206-486-4074. It's lonely in podcast land, and we welcome and appreciate any feedback you might want to share. Act now, and we'll throw in a set of Ginsu knives. Not really.